Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into a really fascinating piece of religious history, and honestly, it all boils down to just one big question.
So let me ask you this. What if the entire foundational miracle of a major world religion, the claim of seeing and actually touching an ancient sacred artifact, what if all of that rested on the sworn testimony of just 11 guys? That's the exact scenario we're digging into today.
All right, so the origin story of the Book of Mormon, a sacred text for millions of people, it all centers on this one thing, a set of golden plates. And back in 1829, 11 men signed their names to formal statements declaring that they had seen and in some cases even held these very plates. Their testimony is still printed in every single copy of the book.
Okay, so to really get to the bottom of this, here's how we're going to break it down. We'll start with the claim itself, which is pretty extraordinary. Then we'll meet the two different groups of witnesses. After that, we'll dive into their really complicated legacy, and then explore what our source calls their unbroken testimony. And finally, we'll look at a unique way their genuineness was rated.
So let's jump right in with the claim. And you got to understand, this isn't just some dusty old footnote in a history book. We're talking about the very foundation for one of America's most significant homegrown religions. Everything really hinges on whether these men were telling the truth.
But here's where it gets interesting. It's not as simple as 11 guys just signing one piece of paper. Their experiences were actually separated on purpose into two very different kinds of encounters. This created two totally distinct types of evidence, which is a really key point.
Which naturally brings us to these two groups of witnesses. And let me tell you, understanding the difference between these two groups is absolutely crucial if you want to grasp the arguments in our source material.
So on one hand, you've got the three witnesses, Oliver Cowdery, David Whitmer, and Martin Harris. Their claim was totally supernatural. They testified that an actual angel of God came down and showed them the plates. But then you've got the 8 witnesses, and their claim, it was just physical. Joseph Smith simply showed them the plates, and they said they were able to handle them and even heft them to feel how heavy they were. So you see the difference, right? One group's testimony is all about a divine spiritual event, while the other's is about a tangible, physical one.
And this quote right here, it perfectly captures what the three witnesses were all about. Their statement is just filled with this divine language. An angel of God came down from heaven. It's a straight-up testimony of a miracle.
Now listen to the language from the 8 witnesses. It's a totally different vibe, right? Notice the words they use, seen and hefted. This isn't about visions from heaven, it's about the physical sensation of weight and seeing engravings on metal with their own eyes. It's a very grounded, almost ordinary description of a pretty extraordinary object.
Okay, so if the story just ended right there, it would be pretty straightforward, but it doesn't. The lives of these men got incredibly complex, and that led to a very complicated legacy for their testimonies.
And this leads to the absolute heart of the matter. What happens to the credibility of a founding miracle when the most important witnesses have a major falling out with the founder? Does it just shatter the whole story? Or does it maybe do something else entirely?
And we're not talking about some small spat here. This was a huge deal. All 3 of the main supernatural witnesses, Cowdery, Whitmer, and Harris, were excommunicated or left the church, and so did half of the physical witnesses. This was a massive fracture. The majority of these key guys became totally separated from the movement they helped start.
Yeah, and this separation wasn't just a brief thing. This timeline shows us that the big break really happened around 1838. Now, 2 of the 3 witnesses, Oliver Cowdery and Martin Harris, they did eventually come back to the church years later, but David Whitmer, he spent a full 50 years, half a century, outside the faith he helped found, and he never returned. That long period of being estranged is really key here.
So, with all that conflict, all that bad blood, you'd think their testimonies would just fall apart, right? Well, that's what brings us to the core argument from our source material, something it calls the unbroken testimony. Here's the twist. The source material actually argues that all this conflict, all the excommunications, it actually makes their testimony stronger. And you might be asking, how in the world does that make sense? Well, think about it. These men had every reason to be bitter. They'd lost friends, status, their whole community. If the whole thing was a lie, this was the perfect time to expose Joseph Smith, get their revenge, and say it was all a fraud. But they never, ever did.
Just take David Whitmer. After 50 years of being completely separated from the church, with nothing to gain from it, on his deathbed, he reconfirmed his original story. He had spent decades criticizing the church's leadership,
but he never once backed down from his claim of what he saw that day in 1829.
And it's pretty much the same story for the other group. John Whitmer, one of the 8 witnesses who said he physically handled the plates, was also excommunicated. Almost 40 years later, he was still describing the physical details. "I handled them," he said. That consistency, even when faced with deep personal conflict, is really the central pillar of the source's whole argument.
So when all is said and done, what's the final tally? Out of these 11 men, including the ones who became bitter critics of church leadership, how many ever denied what they claimed to have seen and touched? According to every historical record we have, that number is 0.
Now, to really hammer this point home, the source we're looking at does something pretty unique. It offers its own analysis that it calls a rating of genuineness.
So what is this? Well, it's a special scale they created just for this analysis. It runs from 0 to 50, where 50 represents the highest possible credibility you could have. And the score is based on looking at the consistency of their actions and their testimony throughout their entire lives.
And when you look at the scores, it's kind of mind-blowing. David Whitmer and John Whitmer, the guys who were excommunicated and never came back, they score an incredibly high 44 out of 50. Oliver Cowdery, who left but then returned, he scores somewhere between 40 and 45. That's right up there with Hyrum Smith, who stayed faithful his whole life and was martyred with his brother Joseph. He gets a 45. So the excommunicated witnesses score just as high as the most faithful one.
All right, so let's just boil this all down. What are the big takeaways here? First, all 11 witnesses stuck to their story for their entire lives. Second, not a single one of them ever took it back, not even when it would have been way easier for them personally to do so. And finally, and this is the big one, the source makes this really powerful argument that all their personal conflict actually works as evidence for their sincerity, not against it.
So look, this analysis makes a really compelling case that these 11 men were sincere, that they truly believed what they said. But does a lifelong testimony, one that holds up even through bitter conflict, actually prove that what they claimed they experienced was real? And that, well, that's the question I'll leave with you. Thanks for joining us on The Explainer.